Outside, a cold wind punished those who dared to walk the streets. But near the fireplace, Mr. White and his son played a game of chess, while his mother knitted sitting on an armchair. With this weather, I believe Morris won't show up. Focus on the game. I've checked you. Why did we decide to live in this god-forsaken place? Checkmate. Haha. A gate was heard opening. It's him. Would you believe it? I want you to meet Sergeant Major Morris. It's a pleasure to meet you. Mr. White has always told me a lot about you. Sit right here near the fire to warm yourself. Would you like a drink, Major? Thank you very much for your hospitality. The reception went well. They talked about the old days before the Major left for overseas missions. Maybe it was the effect of the whiskey, because the Major's story started to get more melancholic. It's been 20 years that I've known the world. I would have liked to go to India and meet that exotic land. What nonsense. It was much better that you stayed here. Tell us about that monkey's paw that you mentioned in the letters we've exchanged. Monkey's paw? I have it here. At first glance, it looks like a banal souvenir, but appearances can be deceiving. Jesus Christ. But what's so special about this? It has a long-standing spell cast by a prominent Indian fakir. He wanted to prove that destiny rules men's lives, and by trying to interfere, man attracts only evil to himself. The first 3 who carried the monkey's paw could have 3 wishes granted. And why don't you ask yours? I already did. And did the paw grant yours? Yes, said the Major with a funeral tone. Has anyone else had their wishes fulfilled before you? Yes. My boss, Colonel Graham, his last wish was death itself, and that's how I got the paw. If you have already had your wishes fulfilled, why do you still keep the monkey's paw with you? I'm a fool. I thought I could sell it to someone. But even more fool would be the one who would buy this artifact based on a fictitious story. All of a sudden, the Major threw his paw into the fireplace. No, Mr. White pulled the paw out of the flames. It was better to have let it burn. If you don't want it, I can keep it. My wish was to destroy it. If you want to keep the paw, fine, but don't blame me for the consequences. I want to keep it, but does it work? Just hold it in your right hand and say your request out loud, but there will be consequences. Mr. White was delighted with the paw. At dinner time, the mysterious atmosphere dissipated, replaced by a more pleasant environment. At the time of leaving, the Major greeted his friend and gave him one last piece of advice. Choose your wishes wisely. Right after the Major left, the family commented on that curious experience. If the story of the paw is as true as the other adventures he told during dinner, this is a really exotic item. Now I must think about my wishes. Ask to become emperor, and a second, ask to stop being dominated by your wife. The mother ran after the boy to slap him while he fled, laughing. It's not easy to choose. I already have everything I want, health and a happy family. So at least ask the paw to pay the mortgage on the house. It's £200 if I'm not mistaken. It doesn't cost to try. I want £200. Right after making his request, Mr. White shouted and let go of the paw, scared. It fell to the floor. It moved in my hand. It looked like a snake, and a finger now seemed to be bent. If you say so, but I don't see any money. Father and son smoked their pipes before bed. The Major said that wishes don't simply come true. The object of desire appears naturally, even looking like a coincidence. It was a fun night, Father, but I'm going to sleep. It's already late, and I have to work tomorrow. The next day, the White family had breakfast, while they laughed at themselves for being so naive and believing the Major. Be careful, Dad, when you leave home. £200 may fall on your head, but it doesn't work like that. The Major said that the wish would come true randomly. I'm going to the factory. Don't spend all the money before I come back. You're funny. You don't believe it, but the paw moved in my hand right after I made the request. Of course it did, dear. Mr. White stopped smiling and decided to read the newspaper, but he was sure of what had happened. In the middle of the afternoon, Mrs. White, through the window, saw two gentlemen lined up in front of her house, looking hesitant. They decided to knock on the White family's door and were welcomed by Mrs. White. "We're here on behalf of Ma and Megan's. Did something happen to my son?" "Unfortunately, we don't have good news." "Christ, what happened? Just say it." "A terrible accident happened and your son was swallowed by the machine. It was all extremely fast. He didn't suffer." Mrs. White fell to her knees on the ground and was supported by her husband. But what followed left Mr. White even more incredulous. "The company is not responsible for the accident, but even so, we would like to compensate the family with a substantial amount." At this moment, Mr. White was shocked, and an intense cold shiver went up his spine. With great fear, he gathered his strength and asked, "How much would that be?" £200. When Mr. White heard the figure, he fainted. The young man's burial took place at the new cemetery a few kilometers away from the White family house. It was a simple and discreet ceremony. The couple, still shocked, walked back home. It was a long way, but they were in no hurry to return. They knew the pain of not finding their son at home would be unbearable. The following days were quite melancholic for the White people. The couple barely exchanged words. The days seemed longer. The son had already died a week ago, and the insomniac couple looked at the ceiling over their bed. Suddenly, Mrs. White took a leap. Her husband screamed, scared. "The monkey's paw!" She stood up, quickly getting out of bed, surprising her husband. "Where is the monkey's paw?" Mrs. White was desperately looking for the paw in the room. "I want the paw. You didn't destroy it, right? It's in the first drawer of the dresser." Mrs. White found the paw where her husband indicated. "Oh, thank God." She grabbed it with both hands, looking at it crazily. "How did we not think of this before?" "What? We still have 2 wishes. That's silly. Everything was just a terrible coincidence. Grab the paw and do it again." "What? Are you crazy? Ask our son back. He's been dead for 10 days. I didn't want to say this, but he was so disfigured that I could only recognize him by his clothes. It doesn't matter. I want my son back." Mr. White grabbed the paw in terrible fear. "Ask it now." Like the first time, he grabbed the paw and said, I wish my son to live again." He felt the paw moving again and let it go, scared. Strengthless, he sat on his armchair. His frantic wife looked out the window, waiting for her son. Some time passed, and nothing happened. Mr. White felt relieved because he feared what could happen. He took his wife to his room, trying to comfort her. "It's a pity, my dear, but this paw is a sham." The couple returned to the room without saying a word and laid in bed. They spent some time in bed, thinking about how stupid it was to believe that an animal's paw would resurrect their son. Suddenly, there was a strange noise in the house. Mrs. White got agitated. "What's that?" "A rat, surely. I saw a big one this morning." The couple heard the noise again. A rat. This time it seemed to come from the front door. "That's our son. He's back." Mr. White, afraid, tried to hold his wife by the arm, asking her to be rational. Logically, he would take a long time to arrive. The cemetery is a few kilometers away. What his wife said made sense. Mr. White was trembling because he had no idea under what conditions his son would appear. To be continued. After all, the Major had warned that the paw would end up cursing anyone who tried to change fate. An even stronger knock was heard. Mrs. White ran to open the door. She tried to stick the key in the lock, but her hands were shaking with emotion, which made the task more difficult. "Please do not open the door." Mrs. White was fighting with the lock that seemed stuck, preventing her from meeting her son again. Mr. White was consumed by terror. He was terrified that his son's rotten carcass would enter the door like a living dead in an act of desperation. He looked for the monkey's paw, which had fallen to the ground, and he asked for his last wish. Mrs. White opened the door, and an icy stream of air invaded the house. She bowed her head and sighed in disappointment, much to her husband's relief. He grabbed the lamp and, with courage, looked to see what was outside. The road that passed in front of the house was calm and empty.